in obeying the commands of life that God has given you. You obey God, therefore He will forgive you and admit you into paradise. This was the way the Bible taught it. Jesus taught the same thing. And then we get to Paul, and Paul writes a letter to the Galatians. And in this letter of Galatians, Paul rebukes the church at Galatia by saying to them, pretty much, if you translate the Greek, it says, "Oh, foolish Galatians." He calls them fools. He says, and he calls them fools because he asked them, why have you become so trapped up in this law? Why have you become so trapped up in this law, which is a curse? And Paul equates the law with a curse. And he says that this law is cursed. Therefore, Jesus came to free us from this curse by taking the curse upon himself. And then Paul quotes a verse from the Old Testament where he says, "For surely everything that hangeth on a tree is cursed." Because even Paul himself in the New Testament says that the crucifixion was a stumbling block for the Jews. He says this thing, the crucifixion, is a stumbling block for the Jews. Because the Gentiles would go to the Jews and tell them that the way to salvation is to believe in the crucified Christ. And they would laugh at them because by the law of the Old Testament, anything that goes on a cross, anything that is hung on a tree is cursed by God. So this was the entire reason that when they were taking Jesus to see what to do with him, that they were continuing to say crucify him. Because they were saying crucify him because they were telling them, if you want to discredit him, if you want to make him to be not who he says he is, and you want to prove that, then crucify him. Because if you can crucify him, he is not the Messiah. By our own book, if you can crucify him, he's not the Messiah. So this was why they said crucify him. And this, as Muslims, now we know that he was not crucified. Because by God's own law, he could not be crucified if he was the Messiah. And we believe him as the Messiah. So all these things came into huge conflict with me. This set off a whirlwind of conflict with me. So I was in a frenzy. And I started telling my friend, and he realized that I was in a Christian crisis, as to say. You know, I was in real crisis. So he took me to back to the scholars at Bob Jones, and he also got me in touch with some Bible scholars at the Moody Institute in Chicago, which is one of the biggest evangelical schools in this country, the Moody Institute, which is where I plan to perhaps do my graduate studies after Bob Jones. And they came together and they had, you know, an intervention, as to say, you know, they tried putting, they began to think, because I started to believe that this book cannot be from God. It cannot be from God because there's too much in it that does not make sense. And then I also started to notice the contradictions of the texts. Started reading the text, I started to realize that not only are there contradictions in what the text says, which there are thousands of them, and for sake of time, there's no need to go through them. If you want to know them, there are many books out there that will show you them. Books written by non-Muslims, to say. Bart Ehrman, go to Barnes & Noble, ask for any book by Bart Ehrman, and there'll be plenty of them. He's the head of religion at UNC Chapel Hill, and also a very good friend of mine. He wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, Who Changed the Bible and Why? The greatest evidence on Bible textual criticism that I've ever seen. Not only did I notice changes in the text, but changes in the way the language was spoken. Because you can tell in Hebrew when God is speaking, because it is an extremely eloquent speech, a speech that is not like any type of human speech. You can tell the difference. And then you can see when it automatically changes to almost like slang. It changes to like uneducated speech. So, and it goes back and forth, and you can see this. Someone who knows language, they will see this. You can see this. It's like having a person standing up here with a PhD in English speaking and a fourth grader speaking. You can tell which one is which. Even if they were behind the screen and they wrote it on a piece of paper, you would tell which one is which. So they had a laying of hands session on me and everything to try to get these evil spirits that they said were in me out. And I ended up talking to one guy at Bob Jones University, and I don't want to give out his name because he will probably not be very happy with me saying that he is the person who wrecked my faith in Christianity. And he will not be very pleased if I were to give out his name and accredit that to him, because he's probably still a professor at Bob Jones. But he sat me down and he said, you know what, Brother Joshua? You're seeing all these things that are happening, mistakes, things that don't make sense, things that don't look right. And he said, you're going to see it and you're going to continue to see it if you continue to read this book. He said, because this book was written by man's hands. And anything that has been touched by man's hands will have fingerprints still left on it. He said, so what happened was, when all these things you see wrong, is that somebody probably just made a mistake. He said the copy of the copy of the copy, the scribe who copied this person, this, so on and so forth, probably one of them made a mistake, and somebody copied his mistake and made his own mistake, and then that person compounded the other person's mistake, and maybe somebody came back and corrected one person's mistake and then added his own. He said, so that's probably what happened, and you have the final product of all of that. And that just, I had to sit down and actually take that for a second, because I was fighting inside myself to try to keep this book at the status that it has always been in my home, the inerrant Word of God. This is how I was taught. Inerrant Word of God without error. Revealed by divine inspiration through men and transcribed onto paper. And I began to realize that this was not the case. So needless to say, and for the sake of time, I left Christianity altogether. I decided that I knew God existed. For that was for sure. I could look around me and tell God existed. That was a no-brainer. I knew God existed. I knew He had a purpose for my life. I knew that there were prophets. I knew all of these people were not remembered so well in history and they did nothing. So I knew there was something behind all of this. I just wanted to find it. So I started studying every religion I could find. I went back to Judaism and studied Judaism, and I found the same thing that Jesus found. That there were parts of Judaism that was too tied up in the law, and they gave no room for spirituality. There was no room for spirituality left, because you just had to follow the law. You step this way, you step this way, you turn left, you turn right, that's it. And then there was other parts of Judaism that was so far gone in spirituality that the law was non-essential. So I knew there had to be a medium. I knew that God's true religion would be balanced, for sure, because life is balanced. In order for life to exist in harmony, it must be balanced. So I moved on from Judaism. I studied Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism. I studied every type of ism. Anything that had an ism at the end, I tried to study it. I even studied Bushido because I'm a martial artist by profession. So I studied Bushido, the code of the samurai, all this other stuff. I even studied Wiccan, all of these different things. I studied all of them. And in every one of them, I would see glimpses of the truth. I would see glimpses. Kind of like a panhandler pandles for gold at a stream and he finds flakes. I would see flakes, but no nuggets. There was nothing. I was not hitting the core, as to say. And I don't want to discredit Islam. I don't want to discredit Islam because I went to the public library and pulled out a book on Islam. And this book said that Muslims, or it referred to them as Muslims, which for sake of time, I will just let you know is a very derogatory word. In Arabic, it means one who oppresses others. Referred to them as Muslims, and it says that Muslims worship a moon god, and they bow their heads 5 times a day to a box in the desert, and they can have as many women as they want, and they're all Arab, and things of this nature. And what else did it say? That they can kill non-Muslims anytime, any place, in any way they wish without scrutiny, and that they would get 70 virgins in heaven and all this other stuff. So needless to say, I made it about 4 chapters in the book. I put the book back. Thank you very much. I took a one of the big fat magic markers and erased Islam off and said, I'm moving on. And I said to myself that if I convert to any other religion, Islam would not be the one, for sure. Thank you very much. I'm done with that one. And so being 17 years old and having been searching for the truth for about 1.5 years, 2 good years, about 1.5 years, I'll give it good credit, about 1.5 years, really hard searching, I became very frustrated. I became very angry with God.